Cool. Uh, hey, this is Stephen Davenport. I'm here as part of the inaugural episode of the podcast series I think we'll be calling The Trees, joined by Dr. Bryce Pardo. And we're in the strange position of being two friends who are trying to convert this to a podcast for unknown purposes that range in formality. So it's a little hard to really pick the correct tone for this. Bryce, why don't you jump in actually and just go ahead and tell folks.
Sure. Yeah. No, this is something that I think the idea came from a lot of our informal discussions over the years, just regarding life, philosophy, religion, all sorts of just different social questions that we want to answer and would like to explore. And some other folks have thought that our our ideas have been interesting, and so we thought maybe this would have appeal beyond our kind of own back and forth. And we're looking to hopefully get some inputs from other people that may be interested in some of these questions and to explore them with them on this series.
I like that.
Yeah, just a background about us maybe. You and I have similar interests. We met each other about 5 years ago working in Jamaica, where we were hired by the government to help them size the cannabis market and to help them define kind of recommendations for regulations regarding the medical marijuana market in the country there in the island. And so since then, we've been exploring all sorts of interesting ideas regarding, like I said, drugs, life, philosophy, love, religion, and kind of our place in society and society's the trajectory of the species. So to kind of really put it out there.
I think that's really great. Yeah, I really like that. And obviously we've had a lot of time together at the Rand Corporation, where I've done my PhD, and you are a researcher now. Mm-hmm. And I am technically a former researcher, but I think we'll become a researcher again for a couple of weeks and then return to being a former researcher. It's a little hard to keep track of. I really liked what you just said about just about trying to kind of share, right? Like, I do think we've had a lot of interesting discussions, and I have a lot of discussions with you that I can't have with a lot of other friends, because
likewise,
you have a very interesting perspective, and I think we both have certain kind of like obscure or mystic propensities, right? Like this love of abstract ideas that are radical, but not just like left radical, not just Bernie Sanders radical, but kind of a little bit anachronistic, right? And out of our time. Not to exaggerate, our novelty, but I find myself having some of these conversations, and they're kind of the favorite conversations I have throughout the day. Not just with you, but on this kind of stuff. Yeah. And given the isolation that we are in Corona, but also just the nature of the world, when you start to ask, like, how can I share these things that are really valuable, mm-hmm. but confined to these small spaces? How do I share this with like a larger group of people? Of course, without succumbing to ego drive and ambition and everything that is just so toxic throughout social media, and not right. Even social media, just our friends networks and our relationships. Right.
And then on top of that, you have to compete with all the other blogs and podcasts and everything else out there that's drawing for people's attention. So what I guess sets us apart is, well, I don't know what sets us apart yet.
I think it's good to not know, right? I think, yes, when you know too much, what sets you apart, it's not good. It's not a good.
I didn't know that yet, but I'm hoping that we can provide some outside of the box thinking when it comes to certain questions or certain ideas about life, about society, about people's places in the world. So I don't know where we want to, what kind of topics we want to touch on.
Yeah, let's continue this a little bit. I want to introduce so let's talk briefly about this idea. I mean, I had this name for this podcast kind of popped into my head yesterday. Mm-hmm. And why don't we go ahead and why don't you talk a little bit first about this theme you have told me about with hawks and doves?
So yeah, the hawks and doves, most people see the world, I think a lot of social problems or a lot of social issues are often cast in kind of diametrically opposing camps. There's, red versus blue, hawks versus doves, pro and anti. And that generally works for, I think, most people's consumption when they think about it in very binary terms. But when it comes to, say, drug policy in particular, we do see the hawks, the drug prohibitionists, and the doves, the legalizers. And there's one day, a mentor of ours, Mark Kleiman, he's always been someone who has tried to see between the layers and try to ask questions about, beyond what is obviously patently obvious. And he has been often cast as an owl, kind of a solitary hunter who sits above the fray and tries to take in, both sides of the ideas and tries to find some sort of consensus agreement, what really matters between these two groups, because oftentimes they're talking past each other. And ever since then, I've found that that kind of way of framing it to be quite useful, to kind of being able to see beyond just the binary way things are cast. And so that was the hawks and doves, and then the introduction of the owl sitting in between the two, kind of just trying to take both sides, or at least trying to understand both sides, and trying to kind of push the arguments or push the ideas further still. And then you had this idea about
and talk a bit about the hawk and so what is the hawk position versus the dove position generally in drug policy?
Well, in drug policy, so the hawk position is often those who want to prohibit access to using psychoactive substances. The prohibitionist model that has existed for over 80 years now in this country, 100 years in some cases. So it's something that, it's a traditional prohibitionist model when it comes to drugs. These things are not used. They're morally, the use of drugs is immoral. And so it requires a kind of a moral response to drugs. And then there's the other side, the doves, which looks at drugs and says, it's not really the drugs. It's the way in which things are done. We actually could legalize this stuff and we can reduce some of the harms associated with drug prohibition. And Mark would always say, well, both are right and both are wrong. It's how we actually do certain things, and it's we can do less in some instances and actually have better outcomes. And so I think that was a unique heterodoxical position that most people do not see. Most people see things in terms of pro and anti, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And so Mark kind of took a step back and said, well, what really matters here? What is the question that we really truly want to answer? It's about trying to reduce harms associated with drug use and the over-enforcement of drug control policies. And so in that, he was able to, I think, he was able to try to see the many shades of gray that helped a lot of people think about this issue with a little more nuance.
Yeah.
And I tried to use that way of thinking, and I tried to apply it across all dimensions of social policy problems in the world today. So, you could extend the same way of thinking to other binary social problems like abortion or gun control. It is more difficult to kind of find the nuance, but it oftentimes will result in a better way of thinking about a problem.
So right. So you mentioned the owl as a predator, and I know we talked about this last night. Owls are fierce.
Yeah.
Like they're very fast. They got big talons and sharp beaks, but they're also watchful, right? So this idea of an owl is someone who's more observant. It's a bit condescending, obviously, to the other animals at play here. And I think that condescension is really important, frankly, to notice, because it is a real thing. I think this wonk perspective believes it has certain detachments from identity, which often it has. And I think what we've looked for in our mentors in this space are people who do demonstrate that detachment. And you and I will not name these people, but we know among these mentors there's folks with liberal and conservative worldviews, and it does not bear on our opinion of them or their research what their positions are, but rather if that bleeds into like the rigor and objectiveness of what they have to say. And I think that is great. However, it is also important to realize that, who are we fooling? Everyone has a tribe, and even the owl, to extend the metaphor, I don't think has a lot of good color perception. I think they see very well in black and white. I think they detect movement very well. I don't imagine they have a lot of detail in color, right? So there are things that you're missing, right? It's a trade-off. So I had this idea with the trees. I love this idea of the owl, and for a long time, that was sort of like an identity for success in this space. For me, I've kind of had this course where I've been in graduate school and PhD programs for a long time, and I've decided not to pursue traditional academic route.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably, I am not even pursuing a route at all, really, so much as, making sort of incremental orientations.
I would say you're trailblazing rather than following a path.
Sure, I like that. I mean, I assume someone else will travel my path. Maybe, yeah, maybe I'm just wandering. I like that idea as well. Um, but so if you're not an owl, what are you? And I like the idea of zooming out, of seeing this ecology of perspectives and of actors, right?
Mm-hmm.
The hawk and the dove, they have different perspectives on drug policy.
Mm-hmm.
The owl has the drug policy perspective. The owl also, but the trees sort of have a perspective on all the birds. And I really like this idea of zooming out into the ecosystem. But then also sometimes you're already looking at the forest and going into the trees as a zooming in. So, as you know, and with naming my company Aperture, I've really been interested in this idea lately of kind of like changing lens, of shifting perspectives, as a means to really see a broad picture that's like still rich with a lot of detail. And I just think that the background that you and I both have